This is Kwame McDonald with SPNN Sports Rap. And as you know, that's spelled R-A-P. We're being brought to you by Big Daddy's Barbecue, old-fashioned Kentucky barbecue, right here in the historic St. Paul Union Depot, and also Galaxy Coffee Shop on Rice and Cook, run by students at Arlington High School. We have a great guest with us this morning, and so we won't waste any of his precious time. We're going to go right into it. Paul, how are you doing today?
I'm good. My time's no more precious than anybody else's.
Well, that's what they all say.
But I'm pleased to be here with you.
Yeah. Senator Paul Wellstone, former wrestler. Paul, let's go all the way back to when you first remember breathing this good American air, and tell us about how you got where you are today.
Whoa.
Huh?
Into wrestling, or
start with your childhood.
My childhood. Whoa. Well, my father, Leon, both my parents have passed away now, but my father, Leon, was a Jewish immigrant who fled persecution from Russia. He was born in the Ukraine, in Odessa, and then in Tsarist Russia, his family had to keep moving to stay ahead of what were called the pogroms, where the troops would come in and destroy his dad's small business. His dad owned a clothing store. And my father fled when he was 17 in 1914, and he never was able to go back to Russia, and never saw his family again. My mother's family were from the Ukraine, and her name was Minsha Danishevsky, and she was a cafeteria worker. If my mother really liked you, the compliment she would pay you would be to say you were a good worker. Very humble background, a really wonderful person. So these were my parents, and I was born in Washington, D.C., in GW Hospital, and we moved. I lived in a place called Falls Church in Arlington, Virginia, which then was very much a working class area. There were like apartments above stores, and finally, when my dad was 55, I think, my father was 47 when I was born. They were able to afford a home, and they bought their first home, which is a little teeny place, and that's where I grew up. They were, one thing I would say about my parents is that my father, here's a sports connection, they were both kind of an embarrassment to me when I was younger, because they were old generation, and they were also older when I was born, so they didn't fit in with my friends' friends. They weren't cool. And my father stuck out like a sore thumb. And I remember in particular one time when I was playing football, I was 10, I asked him to come, and he never come. He had never seen me play, and he came. And on this day, I was the honest-to-God hero. I scored 3 touchdowns. I think I ran for 80, 75, 65 yards. And my father, you know, he watched it, and then he went back home, and then I came back to our house, and he was in his little office. He was a writer. My dad always wanted to be a playwright, and I walked in, and I said, "What did you think?" And he said, "It wasn't football." And I said, "It was football." He said, "It wasn't football." It turned out I realized he's talking about soccer. Right. He thought it was soccer, which is what he grew up with. And my mother was, and I say this because whenever I'm in schools, I always go to visit with the food service workers. I'm in a school about every 2 weeks because I so appreciate their work. Because my mom, kids used to make, in the junior high school she worked, they used to make fun of the women, mainly women who worked in the cafeteria. They kind of looked down on them then. And, you know, my mother was trying to put food on the table for us, so we didn't have a lot of money. And so I have now really, when I visit schools, I always am kind of to honor my mother, much less food service workers. I always try and see them. And then later on, when I got to be high school age, I realized what a treasure my father was. And every night, I just finished writing a chapter of a book I'm working on called Hot Tea and Sponge Cake at 10 p.m. That's the title of the chapter. We would meet at 10 o'clock Sunday night through Thursday night, not on the weekends. And my mother would make some sponge cake, and we'd have hot tea, and my father for half an hour would talk about the world, and I would just listen. He was my teacher. He spoke 10 languages fluently. He spoke 10 languages fluently. He was the most profound, Kwame, probably the best person that I have ever known in my life.
Isn't that
So I missed both of them.
Sure. And after you grew up, graduated high school, then what did you do?
Well, I went to the Wrestling Connection, and there were two sports. When I was 10, my brother had pretty severe illness, and which really was tough on our family financially, and I went into the kind of junior high years a little mixed up and in a lot of trouble. I mean, I was not that far away from reform school, and my best friend ended up in reform school, which, by the way, didn't reform him. He came out of it a hardened criminal.
Right.
And wrestling really saved me, because I mean, then you couldn't wrestle. Wrestling was for high school, but when I was 10th grade and I was in a fair amount of trouble, I found this sport that I was really good at, and made me feel good about myself. Right. And right away I broke in with the varsity and got a lot of, acknowledgement. And then that transferred to other things. Once I felt good about myself, then I started doing well in school and other parts of my life as well. And then I ended up running. I was also cross-country runner and wound up getting some athletic scholarships in running as well as wrestling. And then I had to make a choice, and I decided to go to the University of North Carolina after high school. And that's where I was an undergraduate, and that's also where I did my doctorate work. And I wrestled there. Right.
When were you in North Carolina, in Chapel Hill?
Well, this you'll appreciate. I arrived in North Carolina. My idea was, Sheila and I met when we were 16, and we were very close. And here's this daughter of Southern Baptist Appalachian coal miners.
Yep.
And I'm the son of these Eastern European Jews, and it was kind of unlikely coalition. But we met and became very close. And she was at the University of Kentucky her first year. I was at North Carolina. And then I just couldn't take the separation, and we were married then 1 week 19. And we were in Chapel Hill all together from 63, Sheila and I, from 63 to 69. And so here's what happens. I'm there and I'm wrestling Division I, which takes time. I'm taking an overload of classes, and I'm working probably 35 hours a week. I made my money reffing sports.
Sure.
Every kind of sport I would ref when it wasn't during wrestling season.
Right.
And we don't have much money, and we're both working hard, but the history. I mean, here we are in North Carolina, 63, 69, the civil rights movement explodes all around us, and I say this to high school students all the time, and what happens is I'm seeing younger people and older people and African American and white joining in, and they're taking on this whole system of apartheid, of discrimination, of denying people service at restaurants, you name it.
Right.
And people are sitting in, and we're watching this. We see it. And people are getting beat up and acid thrown in their faces, but they're taking on this whole system of blatant discrimination, saying, look, we are men and women of worth and dignity and substance. We're not going to let you do this to us. And I say to Sheila, I agree with him, but we don't have any time.
Yeah.
We're working, going to school, wrestling. But pretty soon, it's so powerful that it forces you to take sides.
Sure.
You got to decide, quote, which side you're on. And so we became a small part of that, of the civil rights movement and of anti-hunger and anti-poverty efforts, and then the anti-war movement. And I was lucky to be a student at the University of North Carolina. So I did my undergraduate work there at a little under 3 years, and then I went straight to a doctorate program. But I also became very involved in all the things that were happening.
Interesting. Did you happen to remember, you were there when North Carolina signed Charlie Scott?
That's right.
That's right.
Charlie Scott, I actually...
first black to play for North Carolina.
That's right.
Yeah.
And initially, when I first came there, could have been Frank McGuire's last year, but Billy Cunningham was the best player then.
That's right. That's right.
And then Dean Smith, who, by the way, is a great coach. I'm going to go down to North Carolina. I'm supposed to give. We try to go down once a year to give lectures, and I am definitely going to. I have never had a chance to sit down with him. And Dean Smith and his wife were very active in the civil rights movement.
Yes.
This is a remarkable
Yes,
coach and a
I know.
remarkable person, and I
know.
want to spend some time with him. But yet Charlie Scott came, and there were a whole bunch of good teams. North Carolina. Now I was able to. My only regret from an athletics point of view is that the first year, then you couldn't wrestle varsity. You weren't eligible.
Right, that's right.
But I had a good season. I didn't lose any matches, and I was really proud. I beat a guy who was a Pan Am champ, who wrestled for Fort Bragg. We used to go down and wrestle Fort Bragg. And then the second year, varsity, I won all the matches, and I went to the Atlantic Coast Conference Championship, and I won that. And then I don't know what I would have been seeded, but I probably would have had a good seeding for nationals. And I went to see the coach, and I said, you know, we're expecting a child, and I just can't keep doing this. I got to just do more academics. And he said, you at least should wrestle through the nationals because you're young and you'll never get a chance to do this again. I said, no, I'm finishing up. So I never went to the nationals. And I always think, God, I should have participated.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not going to say on your show, easy to say, well, I could have won it when you didn't do it. I don't know that that would have happened, but I would have loved to have participated. But we just couldn't afford it any longer. There were too many other demands. But I have, since coming out to Minnesota, we have never missed a state wrestling tournament.
Interesting.
And, you know, our kids have wrestled, and I coached at the junior high school. I love coaching. I'll coach again.
Good, good. Let me say this before we leave North Carolina. I lived in Durham from 65 to 67.
You know Charcy Hedgepeth?
Oh, yes.
And did you?
Yes.
And
I know
Howard
Charcy.
Fuller?
Howard, I hate to say this, but it's bragging, but Howard is a protege of mine. I knew him when he was 14 years old
Doesn't
in
surprise
Milwaukee.
me.
I'm the reason Howard Fuller came to Durham because I was the only one that knew him. And I worked with him in the North Carolina Fund with a guy named George Esser.
And George Esser, and there was John, there was somebody else who directed. Anyway, I know the North Carolina.
Yeah,
this
North
is
Carolina
amazing.
Fund.
Small
And my job was to organize rural tenant farmers and get them into on-the-job training. We had OJT then, and I had about 20 counties in Eastern Carolina that I had workers in. I had about 135 workers. And in addition to George Esser, this goes back, but when Elmer Anderson was governor, Elmer L., governor of the state of Minnesota, I was the director of the Commission Against Discrimination for Minnesota. He asked me to go with him to the governor's conference in Hershey, Pennsylvania. There, in the middle of the dance floor at one of the parties, I met Terry Sanford.
Terry Sanford.
And Terry said to me, he says, you know, you need to come down to North Carolina and work with us. You look like you're a good man. I said, well, it's interesting. And then, to make a long story short, several things happened, and I ended up working for the North Carolina Fund in Durham. Terry Sanford was chair of the board.
Yeah.
And I reminded him of that conversation that we had in Hershey, Pennsylvania. So our paths crossed. We may not have known.
Well, for people who are, Kwame won't say this, but I'll say about you. First of all, Terry Sanford was one of my, also one of my heroes, and I love Terry. Your work was with a lot of the community action in Durham, and what Howard Fuller and others were doing is this was basically organizing. This was empowerment work.
Sure.
This was people in the, this was people, poor people who were basically saying our children have a right to a good education.
Right.
We have a right to good health care. We want jobs at decent wages. The same kind of demands right now that are so important. That was a very, very important work. No, I know your work well.
Those are some of the best best years of my life in Carolina at that time.
Well, I still miss. I mean, we wanted to initially. I thought we would stay in North Carolina. I didn't really want to leave the South. And when I applied, I cannot prove this. I do not want. I've never said this publicly, but I think it's true. And again, it's not important any longer. But I just was a small part of the civil rights movement. I was young and had family and was working and teaching, and working on my dissertation later, and I didn't have the time to put into it that you put into it and others, or like John Lewis, who's a real hero to me. But when I finished up, I had a hard time. I wanted to teach in the South, and I think one of the things that hurt me when I applied to a lot of Southern universities probably was the activism. And so it ended up being schools like Carleton, Minnesota, that were interested. And I said to Sheila, well, listen, I hear this is a good school, let me go up there for an interview. And I assured her, given the cold weather, because we used to watch the Vikings games, down there in North Carolina, and we'd get the map out, and we'd see the Canadian border, we'd see these people in snowmobile outfits, and we'd say, those people are out of their minds. That is one place we're never going. We said that to each other. Life is full of mystery, right? And so I said to Sheila, I'm going to go up there, and let me just check it out. And I went up on a day, well, kind of like today, or I mean, it was 20 above, not 20 below. Right. It had just snowed the day before. The sun was out. It was beautiful blue sky, and it felt great. And that was the way it was during my interview in February. So I came back to North Carolina, told people it wasn't that cold in Minnesota, because I'd been there and it wasn't that cold. And when Carleton offered me this job, I said, we'll go for 1 year. That was in 1969. I promised Sheila that we would stay only 1 year. We'd just go up, see what it was like, and then we'd get, but then I fell in love with Minnesota.
Yeah, well, that's good. We're glad you did. Paul, incidentally, I left here 3 times and have come back 3 times and have lived in virtually the same neighborhood. And sometimes I think this program gets to be a love fest for Minnesota because of the good things that I have had, the experiences and so forth for me.
Well, you have done a lot in Minnesota. I'm sorry, it's your show and I'm supposed to be talking about myself, but here's the point. I'm also just wrote a chapter called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men and Women, which is after a book by James Agee called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. I added women, should be added. And my point is that there are people who should be famous for the work they do in the neighborhoods and the communities. Nobody even knows about them, right? Well, you're someone who has built that kind of leadership in our community.
I appreciate that. I thank you very much. I've been blessed all along the way to have a family that's supportive, and a son that's carrying on the work, and so I feel good about it. Now, you got to Minnesota, and you taught how many years at Carleton before you decided, or someone decided for you to run for the Senate?
I taught at Carleton for about 20 years. But what happened was, let's go back to Durham, North Carolina. What happened was, my dissertation, I finished up pretty young age. I was 24, and I kind of just rushed through everything. And my dissertation, the title of my dissertation was Black Militancy, Why? It was a study of Durham, North Carolina. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. When I did this study, people in the community said, you know, you're coming over here from that great white university. We've been studied to death.
I know.
We're sick of being used.
That's right.
What are you going to do to improve our community? And I said to Charcy and others who helped me, they knew a little bit about me, and they said, he's for real. And so I did this study, and I had people in the neighborhood that did the interviewing, and I thought that this dissertation would be connected to the betterment of the lives of the people I'd studied. And after I finished the dissertation, there were articles that I wrote that were accepted, and I think it would have become a book. But I looked at it, and I didn't really feel like it did that. And I pulled the articles, pulled the book, had a falling out of values, and decided that what I would do, if given the chance, is that I would use my skills as a teacher and as a writer, as a political scientist, not to stand on the sideline, but to kind of be involved with people in struggles for justice. I would kind of use my skills to empower people. So when I came out to Minnesota, what I ended up doing was, I was a teacher at Carleton, but I was involved in so many of the different community struggles around the state. I mean, I got to, I wrote a book about organizing among poor people, poor white people in rural Minnesota, Rice County, called How the Rural Poor Got Power, Narrative of a Grassroots Organizer. And I did a lot of community organizing with lots of people struggling, you know, and it was in rural poor people, farmers, labor, some work with homeless people, on and on and on. So in a way, for me, it was 20 years of teaching, writing, traveling, speaking, organizing.
Good.
And that was a good combination.
Yes,
along with a little time for coaching.
Incidentally, Chelsea Hedgepeth is now a lawyer in Atlanta.
Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
She wouldn't even remember me. I'd love to call her though.
Oh, I bet she'd remember
Oh,
you.
I just was a little, you know,
Yes,
teeny.
Yes, I'm sure she'd remember
I'm
you.
gonna tell you what, I'm gonna call her.
Yeah,
I'm gonna call her.
she's in Atlanta.
Is that right?
The
Operation Breakthrough.
yeah, that's what it was.
That's right.
in Durham, and Howard was the major organizer.
That's right.
And we, the North Carolina Fund, was the sponsor of
John Strange.
Yeah,
the other name.
Yeah,
Yeah.
John Strange, right, right. And George Esser, he's up in his years now, but he's still residing there in Chapel Hill.
Yeah. Well, I love, as I said, that's still, our first two children were born there in North Carolina, and I still do have a love affair. I mean, there's part of North Carolina, you know how people talk about love-hate relationship?
Right.
Part of my relationship to the South is love-hate. I love the South.
Yeah, I do too.
And I still travel a lot in the South, and I speak in the South, and then there's parts about the South that I still hate.
Yeah. Next to St. Paul, Durham is my favorite town to live in. I loved it there. And we'll get to talk about
I'll
this
tell you what,
awful lot.
sometime when I finish up in public service, most all my teaching will be in Minnesota because I want to give back to Minnesota what people in Minnesota have given to me, which has been an opportunity of a lifetime. But once in a while, I'm going to teach in North Carolina Central. Would that be it, in Durham?
Yes, in
I'm going
Durham.
to try and teach there.
Yeah. Well, why can't I think of that lawyer who's now the president there? He was a great civil rights lawyer. Incidentally, I hired Vernon Jordan as one of my consultants while I was at North Carolina.
That's something else.
So fun. Tell me about your kids.
Well, we got, now you know there is a song in the play Fiddler on the Roof called Sunrise, Sunset, which is all about how fast life can go by.
That's right.
Now our kids are grown up and older, and our children are 34. We had our first child, we're 20. 34, 30, and 27. And our oldest son, and we have 3 grandchildren. Although Marsha, our daughter, is going to become remarried, and she is going to marry a guy, Todd, who has 3 children too. So we're going from 3 to 6 grandchildren, which I'm excited about overnight. So David's done a lot of work with me politically. He's a great organizer. He's right now doing a lot of work with Rick Kahn on low-income affordable housing, low moderate income affordable housing, a lot of it in rural areas, and it's a huge need everywhere. Everywhere, cities too, suburbs and rural areas. So he's working in the housing area. Marsha, our daughter, is a Spanish teacher, and she's a high school Spanish teacher at White Bear Lake High School. And Mark, who lives in St. Paul and who's 27, is married to Jesse, who's from Chile, and he's fluent in Spanish as well. He spent half a year in the Pilsen neighborhood in Chicago, and he spent a year at the University of Madrid, and his love, and he's now going back to school to teach, and he's doing a lot of substitute teaching in St. Paul, and he was a state champion wrestler. He's a good wrestler, and then he had an ACL injury and couldn't wrestle in college, but his love is soccer and wrestling. Very good in soccer, and so he's going to coach and teach, and I'm sort of hoping he'll do it in St. Paul, but he'll have to decide. Right now he's coaching at Apple Valley, and they got unbelievable team. They're like
Yeah.
There's a lot of great teams. Minnesota is probably one of the top 5 wrestling states in the country.
Right.
Not probably is. But Apple Valley this year is probably levels above everyone else. They are so tough. In fact, they're going to wrestle a team in Ohio. Apple Valley is ranked 2nd in the nation in wrestling, and they're wrestling a team in Ohio, I think called St. Ed's. Anyway, in Ohio, they're ranked Catholic school, ranked number 1, and Apple Valley is going in February to wrestle them.
Whoa.
It's going to be a great match.
That really,
I'd love to watch it.
Yeah,
I don't think
yeah, that really is. No, before we go to that, let's go to Bill Bradley.
Yeah.
Candidate for president, former great Knicks player,
Right.
Rhodes Scholar,
Right.
Princeton,
Right.
all of that.
Right.
Will he make a good president?
He's the first tall guy I've ever supported for anything.
Is that right?
Kidding. Yeah, I think Bill would be. I mean, I actually is first when I knew. I mean, I have been lucky in that all my life I've been in pretty good health, and I have now, believe it or not, I'm keeping track. I think for 40 years, I've worked out 6 days a week for 40 years. But darn it, this past 2 years, I got hit with a spinal cord surgery and then a ruptured disc. So I had to pull out. I was thinking, I wanted to do a presidential race, but when I pulled out, I just physically can't do it. I right away threw my support to Bill. I was the first person in the Congress to support Bill Bradley. And a lot of it, when you ask if he could be president, let's start with character. Bill has a lot of integrity. He's for real. He cares. His passion is for, like opportunity for every child, every person. He's probably more willing than almost anybody in American politics today to take on the racial divide, to talk about race,
Right.
and to talk about all the ways we can make America yet better. And if he can win the nomination, I think he'll win the general election. It's going to be tough. You've got a sitting vice president with a lot of machinery and support behind him, but Bill's got a definite fighting chance of winning this. And Schill and I are traveling a lot for him right now.
Good. He's getting great support from former athletes. It's very interesting.
He is.
And I don't understand how present athletes. Well, yes, I do too. It's all about endorsements and where your money comes from, and
it's different, isn't it?
And they can't support anybody.
I don't. Michael Jordan, for example, has contributed to Bill's campaign. I don't know how much he's going to do. I hope he'll do a lot. Bradley and Phil Jackson are best friends. Right. But I don't understand this either, and you may know this better than I do, because I haven't really had the chance in recent years to get to know very many of the professional athletes well. But there was a time when, and I'm not trying to sort of say, oh, everything was perfect years ago. I'm looking ahead. I'm not looking back. But athletes used to. They would take risks. They would be outspoken for what they believed in, regardless of what effect it had on endorsements and all the rest. And I don't know if that's so much the case any longer.
Well, I think one of the things was black athletes weren't getting that many endorsements. Period. For instance, when the Lakers, Minneapolis Lakers, went down to play a team, and they played in West Virginia, Hot Rod Hundley's hometown. Right. And Elgin Baylor refused to play because he couldn't stay in the hotel. We live in D.C. in an apartment about a mile from where Elgin Baylor grew up. Oh, is that right? Yeah. Elgin used to live on Fuller, right here in St. Paul. Lived 2 doors from me, and we used to race. I had a '56 Buick, and he had a '56 Oldsmobile, and we would race over to Oxford Playground to play ball. For those of you all don't know Elgin Baylor, he was a player. Oh yeah, he's one. He's got to be listed one of the top 5. I agree. Yeah, I agree. And he was just so much different. I mean, he stood up. when others wouldn't.
I know.
And
I wish there would be more of that now, because I'll tell you, to jump to right now, I tell you, there are, first of all, I support, Bill and I don't agree on all issues, but I respect his integrity. But there's a set of issues that deal with race and gender and poverty in children, which are much more connected than we want to admit to as a nation.
Yes.
Okay, today, with this economy going great guns.
Right.
And I just think if there's any national disgrace, it's the fact that children are the poorest group in America.
I agree.
And Bill is willing, I think it's in his soul. I think if Bill gets elected president, he'll take real leadership on this, and I want to be there, you know, in Washington, time we can make those changes. Right now, so much of my fighting for people is to prevent the worst, not to do the better. I want to get back to doing the better again.
That's right.
And I wish more people would, and again, I'm saying it on your show, and I'm not trying to be self-righteous, but I wish more people who come from some of the communities and know what it's like to go through hard times and are now doing really well. Let's say successful athletes. I wish that they would, if they can't do it like you do it, or the Winfields do it, giving back to community all the time, I wish they could at least be more outspoken about, wait a minute, you know, we ought to be doing better as a nation.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Let's renew our national vow of equal opportunity for every child. Where is it today?
Yeah. Yeah.
Come on, that's the goodness of our country.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's the goodness of our country.
Yeah. You know,
I want to see more of that.
Yeah. When Jim Brown was playing, and Jim Brown, you know, he's one of these kind of people like most of us. If you could cut one of us in half and take the good parts, you know, we'd be perfect. But,
right.
But the part of Jim Brown that I like was his stepping out ahead and trying to make things work. And even today, he visits the prisons and tries to give those guys hope and let them know
that's right. There is that part of it. That's the part you want to emphasize.
Exactly.
You know, when Jim Brown, I tell you, I used to sell programs as a kid at the Washington team. I guess we don't call them the Redskins here.
No.
The Washington team.
Yeah.
I used to sell programs. I made pretty good money.
Yeah.
But get this, the Washington team, you know this, but was the last in D.C., the last segregated team, right?
Yes.
Remember?
Yes.
And by the way, they were rock bottom. They were a seller team.
That's right.
And finally, Kennedy administration, Udall, Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall, ordered them to integrate.
Right.
But when I was selling programs, they have this segregated team, and the Cleveland Browns would come to town. Jimmy Brown and Bobby Mitchell, Mr. Inside, Mr. Outside.
Yeah.
And back then, you didn't have like the season ticket group that had all the season tickets, and there were no seats. You could buy week by week. You could decide. So black people, African American people, would save up for when Jimmy Brown would come.
That's right.
And people would come to this one game, and Jimmy Brown would hold a press conference before the game, and he would say, "I sure enjoy playing against the Washington, quote, Redskins." And of course, everybody knew what he meant, which was, "I'm gonna kick this racist team." And I don't think he ever rushed for less than 230 yards.
Against Washington,
And people would come just to root for him.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, you know, when you said that people would save their money to see the Redskins against Cleveland, it reminds me of when Jackie Robinson broke the line, and people used to get on trains from Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and go up to Chicago when the Brooklyn Dodgers were in, or go to St. Louis Cardinals games when the Brooklyn Dodgers were there. And those were days when people really were together and fought for freedom in the best way they knew how.
But you know what I think has happened? I want to make a jump to right now. I've been in the school just about every 2 weeks for the last 9.5 years since I've been in the Senate. And mainly high schools.
Right.
And I think, here's what I've discovered. It's not true, and you know this, but it is not at all true that young people don't have a sense of community or a sense of justice. In fact, probably more young people at the high school and college age are involved in community service than they were maybe when I was at North Carolina.
Sure.
Okay, mentors, tutors, working in battered women's shelters, legal service clinics, community health care clinics, you name it, child care, working with senior citizens. The problem is that a lot of young people today view community service, and for that matter, their parents as well, view community service as good, and they view political service as bad. They view community service good, political activism as disreputable and unsavory. Follow me? Mm-hmm. And what I say is we need you to do all this volunteer work, but we also need women and men who are willing to fight for good public policy, to really make the major institutional change that will really give everybody opportunities. And it breaks my heart. I'm not trying to put aside some of the tough problems, but it breaks my heart that there isn't more of an emphasis on the positive of a lot of young people that I see. Unbelievable talent, unbelievable heart and soul. And I consider it, for me, it's real important as a senator to continue to call on young people to be their own best selves and to say, look, you all, the future is not going to belong to people who are content with the present, and it's not going to belong to cynics and men and women who stand on the sideline. It's going to belong to people who have passion or are willing to work hard for what they believe in, and it's going to belong to you.
Mm-hmm. I don't like to blame media or any segment of society, but for some reason, it just seems that there's a feeling that people enjoy reading negative things.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of the positive things. Even when you look at student athletes get more credit, more acknowledgement if they score 5 touchdowns in a game than they do if they get a 4.0.
That's right.
In grades, and somehow, and I think the Minnesota State High School League is trying to do some of this, in that they're encouraging schools to award letters for academics.
Oh, yeah. And
they're having contests in arts and sciences and things like that now.
Yeah. Well, two answers to what you just said. One is, unfortunately, I'm going to agree with you. I'd rather disagree. I mean, I do think, I remember speaking at the first academic banquet that Apple Valley High School had. There's a school that's gung-ho in athletics.
Yeah,
they're as tough as any school. But I was really glad to come to this gathering because this was a gathering where they were beginning to acknowledge students who've done well academically. And I don't think I think we need to do both. And there's not enough emphasis on young people who are doing well in school. But I'm not even talking so much about academics. I'm talking about a lot of the other good work that they do. And sometimes it breaks my heart. I have been at gatherings and, to use an expression when I was a kid, cross my heart and hope to die.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have cared if the TV camera or whoever was writing the story had never shown my picture or said a word about me. I wouldn't have. But for example, I'm here, Sheila's not with me, or Molly Wilson, who works with me, dealing with issues that affect violence in homes. Mm-hmm. And, which, by the way, then spills out into our schools and into our communities.
Of course it does.
We had a group of high school students who came together in Minneapolis, and they did some of the most powerful artwork you'd ever want to see. Okay, we brought the display to D.C. But I couldn't believe when these kids had done this marvelous work, I just assumed, and they were being congratulated by Harriet Tubman Center and others for their work. I thought somebody would come to cover it. It was positive. Nobody came. Nobody came,
Right.
You watch the 10 o'clock news, almost all of it's just on the violence. There's hardly anything else there anymore.
I know.
It's very discouraging.
It is. A lot of people think I'm kind of crazy when I say this, but I swear, Paul, I did not need to know about O.J. Simpson and his former wife. I did not need to know that. I wish I knew as much about children being born to wonderful young couples as I knew about those who get killed violently.
Oh, yeah.
I just don't. There's another thing.
It's not that you don't want it. It's not that we want to ignore it, but
no, right.
When I see a teacher at the St. Paul alternative at the Learning Center, and you know, a Georgia Duncan, and I see her putting her hand on that student's shoulder, and I can lip read, and I know what she's saying. I won't give up on you, and don't you give up on yourself. And I see a principal that's got 450 volunteers in his school, or I go to Jackson Elementary School, and I see these teachers dealing with kids who speak 5, 6, 7 languages in homes. Their homes, and 4th and 5th graders, kind of igniting a spark in these kids. Right. And I can give a million. And I see kids out in Monticello doing really great community service work. And I could go on and on. Sure. I want to see that acknowledged.
Yes.
We need to see that acknowledged for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's so much good going on with young people we need to know about. Number two, and I say this all the time to people in public education, hey, I'm willing to deal with the challenges and the problems, and I don't want to let any of us cop out and say we can't do better. But you know what? There's a whole lot of really good work that's going on too in the schools. I want to see that acknowledged as well. Exactly. Especially since some of the harshest critics of the public school teachers couldn't last an hour in the classrooms they condemn. Exactly. No, they couldn't. That's for sure. They couldn't. They're never there. They never visit. They don't know anything. That's for sure. But they bash away. Yep. That's right. What about the NC2A and their disqualifying people from being able to play because of a test on a day that they might give? Well, there's a couple things. And Joe Nathan here in Minnesota, who's really well known throughout our country for his work in education, has really led the charge. But then the NCAA has been they've been just inflexible. I mean, what they have done is they are inflexible. They refuse to, I mean, students can be doing some different kind of work, alternative classes, some of which are even honors classes that they don't count as credit. Right. They can deny students athletic scholarships on that basis. It's just absolutely outrageous, and you know, we continue to try to shake them up. I mean, that's what we're doing now. Now, the other issue, which is a different issue, as long as you mentioned testing, which I really want to spend a lot of time on, because I am very worried that we've got this fast-moving train that everybody calls reform, where the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of we're going to have these standardized tests, and whether a student passes or not determines whether he or she goes from 3rd grade to 4th grade or 8th grade to 9th grade or graduates. Now, a couple points, Kwame. Number one, I'm for accountability and testing, but that doesn't necessarily have to be standardized tests. Right. There's different ways of testing kids, and there's different ways of knowing how they're doing, and we should do that. But there's questions about standardized tests, a couple of different questions. One is whether what does it really test? Some kids can take them, some kids can't. Second of all, does it test ability to write, to think conceptually, sense of irony, you name it. But even more importantly, and I'm somebody who never could do well in these tests, and there's lots of kids with different disabilities that can't. The idea of holding a kid back at grade 8 is outrageous. By the way, the evidence is that when you hold these kids back, they don't do, there's not one bit of evidence that they do better. They do worse. And then usually it's the first step towards dropping out. Okay, but here's the biggest issue of all. By and large, we already know who the kids are. You don't even need to waste the time with the tests. Figure out the income of the family, the educational attainment of the parents, and you pretty much can predict how the kids are going to do. So you don't do anything to change the concerns and circumstances of kids' lives, many of whom come from families from English as a second language, come from families with a lot of poverty, come from parents who aren't necessarily literate, right? You don't do anything to make sure that every child comes to kindergarten not behind, but ready to learn. You do nothing about that. You do nothing about making sure that you give these kids the support they need to do well, to guarantee that each child has the same opportunity to do well. You do nothing about that, and then you give them tests and fail them. Yeah. To me, it's cowardly, because you're going after the kids. So I'm for testing and I'm for accountability, but I am not for the emphasis that I now see on standardized testing as a reform. I don't think it is. Right. Not done alone, nor should it be the only way we measure kids. And if we don't do what we should be doing as a state or a country or a city to make sure that our children all have the same chance to achieve and do well, then I think it's cowardly to then just fail kids that we've already failed.
Right, and we know them, as you point out, we know them by their circumstance. We know them when they enter kindergarten.
That's
we
right.
know who they're going to be.
Sure. The single here, look, we could do what. So people say, well, Paul, what's the positive? Okay, the positive is this. I think Minnesota. If I had a goal for Minnesota, one goal more than any other goal, it would be that Minnesota would be the first state in the United States of America. And this is Minnesota. We've both been talking about our state.
Sure. Where
we can say that every child, by kindergarten, she knows colors and shapes and sizes. He knows how to spell his name. She knows the alphabet, and they've all been read to widely. And every single one of them doesn't come to kindergarten behind, but they all come to kindergarten ready to learn. We can do that.
Sure.
We can do it by making much more of a commitment to pre-K education.
I agree.
We can do it by more tutors and mentors. We can do it private sector, public sector. We can do it. Second of all, I would say that Minnesota, we ought to have the best teachers. Great teachers, well paid, highly valued, who challenge our students, high standards, free to teach, and every child who walks into every school, wherever it is, knows that he or she's loved.
Yes, yes. And you know
what? It'd work.
It would. And you know, the key element there is the teacher getting to know the child and the child's family, the personal
That's right.
relationship.
Students tell me that all the time. All the time. Well, you know it. That's what you do.
Yeah. And that's when they begin to prosper, when they know the teacher and the teacher knows them.
But here's something to worry about for our state and for our country. I'm in high schools all the time. We get into these discussions. We talk about education. I ask the students what makes for good education. They say the teacher. I say what makes for a good teacher. They talk about different things, including what you just said. Then I say, how many of you want to be public school teachers? 5%, maybe 10%. I say, why not? They say, money, but then you know what they even say? Disrespected.
Yeah.
And so we're going to need several million, 2 million more teachers in the country in the next 10 years, and we should be thinking about how to get the very best people in teaching.
Yeah. Paul, you know, when you said that, it just gave me an idea. A light went off in my head. Teachers are in the best position to sell the profession. Just think, you're sitting there, 30 kids in front of you, and an advertiser wouldn't ask for anything better. To be able to touch 30 people.
That's right.
And sell them that this is a great profession.
That's right. But you know what? And I think you hit on something, and I think there's got to be a way to do it. Because it's interesting you say that, because I can think of two quick examples. I was in Alexandria.
Right.
Greater Minnesota right now, rural Minnesota is really, again, economy's booming. Actually, in many ways, we have two Minnesotas.
Yeah.
And the rural Minnesota is falling further and further behind economically. Family farmers are going under, you name it. I was in Alec, and since very few students said they wanted to teach, there were some teachers, and I said that were, there at our gathering. There were a couple hundred students, and I said, "Can I ask you all, why are you teaching?" And these teachers started talking about why they chose teaching as a profession. You could have dropped a pin. The students, I don't think, had ever heard their teachers talk about why they were teaching.
Good point.
I don't believe these students had ever heard their teachers.
Right.
And some of these teachers were saying, because when I was in high school, I remembered a teacher, and he made all the difference to me. And I thought to myself, if in my life I could do that for a young person, that'd be worth everything.
Sure.
And these students were listening. It was so inspiring. Second example, my youngest son, Mark, is at Hamlin now, and to go back to get his certification. And I came to teach a couple of classes, education classes. with some really good professors there at Hamlin, and there were 2 groups of students. And these students were a little older. They weren't 18 or 19. They were probably anywhere from late 20s to, I'd say, mid 40s. And many of them were kind of making change, and they were and I asked them, I said, why do you want to go into teaching? Some of them had been in advertising in different areas. You should have heard them. You'd have loved it.
Yeah.
Because then you get a real sense for, I mean, to be able to have a relationship with a young person, to make a difference in that young person's life, right? That's, you'll never be a millionaire, and teachers should have good salaries and decent working conditions. We should make sure that happens.
That's right.
But boy, that's worth, you do all the work with young people. Why have you ended up doing this? You're not a millionaire, let me ask you.
Well, you know, it's
well, maybe you are a millionaire.
Yeah, I wish I was. Not in coin, but I am a millionaire, not in coin.
That's right.
But I think in my colleagues and people that I teach with, I teach at Arlington, and I'm with 2 other guys, and we have a challenging group of young adolescents, and we relate to them quite a bit. I mean, we try to let them know, we don't try, we just do, by revealing ourselves, revealing who we are. And then they say, well, gee, they went through that. That's what we're going through.
Yeah.
You know, we can do that. And sometimes I ask them, I said, wouldn't you like to have a job like this? Look at me, I come to work dressed the way I want to, and you know, I chill, you know, I'm having fun with you guys. I said, wouldn't you like to have a job like this? And then I tell them what it takes.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, and I think you can look at educators all across the country, and the reason they get into it is pretty similar.
It is.
It's pretty similar, and they want to be able to replicate themselves many times.
Yeah.
To the extent that they are satisfied with who they are, then they would like to replicate that. Paul, we got 5 minutes, man.
I have a lot of respect for the teachers that do this. Go ahead.
We only got 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So, is there anything that we forgot to cover?
No, except, well, here's something. Since we only have 5 minutes left, we'll go back to athletics. You know, I was talking to a friend, Richard Metcalf, the other day, who's a really good labor leader in our state, and he was saying something that I agree with. He was saying that this focus on education, you get a lot of focus on elementary school. You know, hey, you got to get it right here. Actually, you got to get it right way before. Right. And then I told you I'm in a lot of high schools, we get a focus on high schools and standards. You know what we're not focusing on as much as the middle school?
I know.
And I'm going to tell you something. This is, all of us can remember those years.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to tell you, these are trying times.
Oh, yes.
For young people. And I think we ought to also be talking more about that challenge and what goes on and the importance of the work at the middle school level. And I say that because when I was teaching at Carleton, there was 3 years where I coached the wrestling team, the junior high school team, which was about 2.5 blocks from my office. And I used to say, you talk about the song Two Different Worlds. I'd go from Carleton and I'd go over to that junior high school and I'd coach. And a lot of those kids on that team, these were kids, wrestling tends to attract kids a little bit like boxing, at least there at the school. They attracted some kids who, kind of like I was in junior high, were pretty tough kids, and not everything was easy for them.
Physical.
But I loved it. It was like a different world, but I loved it. I want to tell you something else now. I'm going to brag. That team was 1-13. I remember this, see? They were 1-13 when I came on as coach. That was before I coached. And then my first year, we were 500. And the last 2 years, we didn't lose a match.
Get out.
No, we were tough. We beat Apple Valley Junior High School. We were tough.
Paul, you know what? I'm going to tell you why. You got to know those kids.
Oh, it was fun.
You knew their parents. You knew their family. They knew you. See, I'm telling you, that's what it takes in teaching, coaching. The successful teachers and the successful coaches are the ones who knew their kids and the kids knew them.
Well, I think that's. Well, I won't say it about myself. Thank you for saying it, but I do think you're right about coaches in general. And as I kind of a way to bring our interview, and by the way, to an end, and thanks for having me, is to sort of end where we began. I don't put athletics above other things in life, and you said yourself that, you know, there ought to be more emphasis on the academics and athletes that do well, or for that matter, theater, music.
Yeah.
There's so many
Yeah.
extracurricular activities.
Right.
For many kids, that's why they get through school
Sure.
and do well. So there
Sure.
are other things they can do well.
Yes.
But for me, athletics really saved my life. And I have a love affair with it for that reason, and in particular the sport wrestling did.
Good,
And
good.
I'm a classic example of a kid who was
That's good.
heading not in the right direction.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad to hear you say that, and I'm glad that you emphasize that, because you know what happens on this show, and I get teased about it all the time. We start out with sports, and we go all over the place, and we end up with sports. So that's
did again.
That's legit. That makes us legit.
We did again.
Yep. Thanks, Paul. I really do appreciate you coming on, and
Thanks for having me.
we've got to do this again.
Okay.
And I wish you had all day after we go off camera, so we could trade North Carolina stories. I want to thank everybody for being with us again this week. And you know that you can watch this show at 1 o'clock each and every day. As it is slippery outside, I want you to traverse the elements very carefully, because the life you save may be your own.